When America Burned. The untold story of the bloodiest battle ever captured. The earth shook before the men even heard the sound. That is the thing no letter home ever quite captured, no pension record ever adequately described. The way the ground beneath a soldier's feet would tremble and lurch like a living thing in the seconds before a cannonade announced itself to the ears. The soil of western Tennessee had been doing this for 3 days. 3 days of that subterranean shuddering, that bone-deep vibration that traveled up through worn boot leather, through calloused soles, through the knees and into the chest, where it met a heart already hammering with something between dread and a kind of terrible anticipation. The men of both armies had learned in those first terrible hours that the ground here did not belong to them. It belonged to the artillery. It belonged to the dead. It was April 6, 1862, and the place was called Shiloh. The name itself came from a small Methodist church that stood in a clearing near Pittsburgh Landing on the Tennessee River. A modest, whitewashed building where farm families had gathered on quiet Sundays to sing hymns and hear scripture read aloud. Shiloh, a Hebrew word meaning place of peace. Whatever cruel irony history reserves for the naming of things, it spent lavishly here. Because on this Sunday morning, as the first gray light touched the canopy of oak and hickory, and the dogwood trees bloomed white along the ridgelines as if in mockery of what was coming, approximately 65,000 men were about to attempt to destroy one another in the most concentrated violence the North American continent had ever witnessed. Stay with this story, because what begins in those quiet Tennessee woods in the hour before dawn will by nightfall redefine what Americans on both sides of this war understood the word battle to mean. To understand Shiloh, you must first understand the peculiar confidence, some would later call it blindness, that had settled over the Union High Command in the early months of 1862. The war was young, barely a year old, and in the Western theater it seemed to be going extraordinarily well for the federal cause. A young general named Ulysses S. Grant had seized Forts Henry and Donelson in February, with an aggression that electrified the Northern press and sent tremors of alarm through Confederate leadership. His demand for unconditional surrender at Donelson had made him briefly the most celebrated soldier in America. Nearly 15,000 Confederate prisoners had marched into captivity. The Tennessee River lay open to Union gunboats. Nashville had fallen. The psychological momentum of the Confederacy's Western strategy seemed to be collapsing like a wall that had lost its foundation. And so Grant had moved his Army of the Tennessee South along the river, landing his troops at Pittsburgh Landing with orders to wait for the Army of the Ohio under General Don Carlos Buell, whose columns were marching to join him. Together, the combined federal force would then march on Corinth, Mississippi, 22 miles to the southwest. A critical railroad junction where the Mobile and Ohio line crossed the Memphis and Charleston, a junction whose fall might sever the Confederacy's ability to move troops and supplies across the entire Deep South. It was a sound strategic vision. What it was not, what it catastrophically failed to be, was cautious. Grant did not order his men to dig entrenchments at Pittsburgh Landing. This decision would haunt him for the rest of his life, and it would haunt the families of the men who died because of it. The ground around the landing was rough and heavily wooded, broken by ravines and creek beds, and Grant and his division commanders convinced themselves that the terrain itself was defense enough. Besides, Buell was coming. Corinth was the objective. The army was here to train and prepare for an offensive, not to crouch behind earthworks in a defensive posture. Some officers, sensing a danger that their commander did not, expressed unease. It went largely unheeded. 22 miles away in Corinth, the Confederate High Command was conducting a very different kind of calculation. General Albert Sidney Johnston commanded the Confederate Army of Mississippi, and by the late winter of 1862, he was a man operating with the particular clarity that comes from understanding that catastrophe is near. The fall of the Tennessee forts, the loss of Nashville, the steady federal advance, Johnston understood with cold strategic lucidity that if Grant and Buell were allowed to combine their forces and march on Corinth, the Confederate position in the entire Western theater might become untenable. The railroad junction had to be protected. But more than that, the Union Army had to be struck before it could unite. Johnston had perhaps one window, narrow and closing, to hit Grant while he was still alone. His subordinate, General P.G.T. Beauregard, the hero of Fort Sumter and First Bull Run, agreed. Together, they assembled roughly 44,000 Confederate troops, the Army of the Mississippi, and began planning what they intended to be a devastating surprise attack. The Confederates would march north from Corinth, fall upon Grant's unsuspecting army at Pittsburgh Landing, drive it from the field, and destroy it before Buell's reinforcements could arrive. It was in concept a brilliant and audacious plan. Its execution would be something else entirely. The Confederate march from Corinth began on April 3rd, and immediately, almost comically, if the stakes had not been so desperately high, things began to go wrong. The roads were miserable, muddy from recent rains, churned to soup by the passage of artillery caissons and supply wagons, and the boots of nearly 44,000 men. Units lost their way in the dark. Columns collided with one another at crossroads. Men who had never marched more than 10 miles in a day were being asked to cover distances that tested their endurance to breaking. Ammunition was misrouted. Rations ran short. Officers shouted into the night at subordinates they could barely see. And the noise. This was perhaps the most alarming failure of the march. The sheer, undisciplined noise of an army that had not yet learned to move in silence. Men fired their muskets at game along the roadsides, apparently unaware or uncaring that an enemy camp lay a few miles ahead. Drums beat. Orders were shouted at full voice. Beauregard, riding through the column on the night of April 5th, grew so alarmed by the racket that he argued for abandoning the attack entirely, convinced that any hope of surprise had been lost. Johnston overruled him. They would attack in the morning regardless. Johnston's reasoning, uttered in the darkness of a Tennessee night, has been recorded by those who stood near him. "I would fight them if they were a million." It was precisely the kind of remark that men remember after someone is dead. Watch closely, because what is about to happen in the gray, mist-hung hours of April 6th will determine whether 65,000 men live or die, and whether the American Civil War becomes a conflict measured in months or years. The Union camps at Pittsburgh Landing were arranged in a loose, sprawling pattern across the high ground above the river, divided among 6 divisions. The men had been in camp for weeks. Some had settled into the routines of military life with a comfortable fatalism, drilling in the mornings, playing cards in the evenings, writing letters home in the diminishing light. Many of these soldiers were new to war. Some had never heard a shot fired in anger. The 71st Ohio had been in service for less than 3 months. Boys from Indiana and Illinois and Iowa lay in their tents that Saturday night, some sleeping soundly, some lying awake listening to the spring peepers singing in the creek bottoms, some writing the last letters their families would ever receive from them. A few federal officers had seen signs. Patrols had encountered Confederate pickets in the woods. There were reports of movement, of campfires glimpsed through the trees in directions they should not have been. General William Tecumseh Sherman, commanding the division camped furthest forward near Shiloh Church, had received these reports and largely dismissed them. Sherman was not a stupid man. History would prove him to be among the most capable commanders the war produced. But on April 5th, he was not yet the Sherman who had learned what this war actually was. He wrote to Grant that evening that he did not expect an attack. He was wrong in a way that would be measured in thousands of lives. The Confederate assault began at approximately 6 o'clock in the morning. It began with the sound of musketry in the middle distance, and in the Federal camps men emerged from their tents, squinting into the morning light, with expressions ranging from annoyance to bewilderment to slowly dawning terror. Some thought it was pickets skirmishing, or perhaps an accidental discharge, or a drill gone wrong. Then the sound multiplied. Then it became a roar. Then, through the trees, through the morning mist that still clung to the low places in the ground, the men in the forward camp saw something that froze the blood. A line of Confederate soldiers advancing through the woods that stretched impossibly as far as the eye could see in either direction. Gray and butternut and brown, thousands upon thousands of them, advancing in waves, their battle flags moving through the trees like bright wounds. The Federal camps nearest to Shiloh Church disintegrated within minutes. Tents still standing, breakfast still cooking over fires, personal belongings scattered across the ground. The men of Sherman's division fled or tried to fight and were overwhelmed by the sheer mass of the Confederate assault. The noise was beyond description. Those who survived it would spend the rest of their lives unable to fully convey It to those who had not been there, the roar of musketry, the deeper percussion of artillery, the screaming of horses, the screaming of men, the crashing of rifle butts and the tearing sound of lead through leaves and the sickening, meaty thud of bullets striking flesh. The smoke came almost immediately, thick white-gray clouds of it that turned the sunlit morning into a dim, choking murk, through which men ran and fell and fired, blindly and died. Sherman himself was in the thick of it within the first half hour, riding along his collapsing line with a kind of furious calm that would later become famous. An aide riding beside him was shot from his horse. Sherman's hand was grazed by a bullet. A second horse was killed beneath him before the morning was out. He kept moving, kept shouting orders, kept trying to hold together a line that was coming apart like wet paper. Decades later, he wrote that the scene at Shiloh Church in those first hours was the most shocking spectacle of his military life. Coming from a man who would later march through Georgia, burning everything in his path, that admission carries considerable weight. Back at Pittsburgh Landing, Grant was eating breakfast when the sound reached him. He had spent the night at a house several miles from the front, nursing an ankle injured, when his horse had slipped in the mud. The distant thunder told him everything he needed to know. He abandoned his meal, mounted his horse, and rode toward the guns, sending urgent dispatches to Buell, "Come at once," and to his division commanders, and to the Navy gunboats anchored in the river. His composure in that moment was, by all accounts, remarkable. Not the composure of a man who did not understand the danger, but the composure of a man who had decided that panic was a luxury he could not afford. He arrived at the front to find chaos on a scale that tested even his equilibrium. You will want to hold on to this moment, because in the next several hours, on a field of perhaps 3 square miles, events will unfold that no one present, Union or Confederate, will ever fully recover from. The Confederate assault had tremendous early success, but it did not achieve the clean, decisive breakthrough that Johnston and Beauregard had envisioned. The terrain of the Shiloh battlefield, those ravines, those creek beds, those patches of dense second-growth timber, constantly disrupted Confederate unit cohesion. Brigades lost contact with each other. Regiments advanced into pockets of fierce Federal resistance and were stopped or slowed or thrown into confusion. The Confederate plan had called for 3 corps advancing in successive waves across the entire front. But within 2 hours of the opening assault, the assault had broken down into something closer to a dozen separate battles occurring simultaneously across a landscape of smoke and fire and fallen timber. The Federal soldiers, for their part, were not simply running. Many were. The roads back to Pittsburgh Landing were clogged with men fleeing in panic, a stream of demoralized soldiers that would eventually number several thousand, cowering under the bluff above the river in a state of shock. But many others were fighting with a tenacity and ferocity that slowed the Confederate advance at critical moments and denied Johnston the quick, decisive victory he needed before Buell arrived. The most famous of these points of resistance formed almost by accident along a sunken road in the center of the battlefield. The road ran along a slightly elevated ridge through a patch of mixed timber and scrub, and along its length several Federal brigades, survivors of the initial Confederate onslaught, reinforced by units that had been further from the initial impact, had settled into a defensive line. The lay of the ground gave them a slight natural advantage. The combination of the road's shallow depression, the bordering trees and brush, and the open fields that Confederate attackers had to cross created a killing ground of terrible efficiency. The Federal soldiers, men from Iowa, Illinois, and Missouri, many of them farm boys who had been hunting since childhood and could judge distance and lead with a rifleman's instinct, poured fire into every Confederate assault with a steadiness that stunned their attackers. The Confederates came again and again, a dozen assaults, perhaps more. The exact number has been disputed by historians ever since, crashed against this line and broke apart. General Benjamin Prentiss commanded the Federal forces along the sunken road, and his orders were simple and absolute. Hold this position. He held it for 6 hours. The Confederates, in their fury and frustration, would later call this place the Hornet's Nest. The name was precise. Standing at the tree line and advancing toward that sunken road, felt, survivors reported, like walking into a swarm of hornets that could kill you. The air thick with lead, the sound constant and overwhelming. Men beside you dropping without warning. The federal line invisible behind its smoke screen, and yet pouring death with mechanical regularity into every advance. Confederate regiments that approached the hornet's nest with confidence left it shattered. General Braxton Bragg, commanding Confederate forces in that sector, threw unit after unit at the position with a stubbornness that his own officers found appalling. Men who had charged bravely into the line 3 times refused a fourth. Their officers could not entirely blame them. What was happening at the hornet's nest was buying Grant something of incalculable value: time. Every hour that Prentiss and his men held the sunken road was an hour closer to nightfall, an hour closer to Buell's arriving columns, an hour in which Grant could attempt to organize something, anything, that resembled a coherent defensive line along the river bluff. Grant rode across that burning landscape with his staff, assessing, ordering, cajoling, sometimes simply absorbing the scale of what was happening with eyes that, witnesses noted, gave away nothing. He was not winning this battle. He was surviving it. And in surviving it, he was betting with the lives of tens of thousands of men, that he could survive it long enough for the situation to reverse. Albert Sidney Johnston spent that bloody Sunday morning riding across his advancing line, urging his troops forward, directing movements, placing himself in the front wherever the situation seemed to demand his personal presence. He was inspiring in the way that great commanders sometimes are. His physical courage was beyond question, and the men who saw him that morning riding calmly through the maelstrom would remember it for the rest of their lives. Around 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Johnston was near the front lines on the Confederate right flank when a musket ball struck him in the right leg, behind the knee, severing an artery. It was, in the chaos of battle, the kind of wound that might not even be noticed immediately. And Johnston, whether from stoicism or shock or the confusion of the moment, did not report it. He continued to ride. His personal physician had been sent away earlier that day to tend to Federal wounded, in a gesture of chivalry that would shortly cost the Confederacy its commanding general. Within 30 minutes, Albert Sidney Johnston bled to death in the saddle. The loss was catastrophic. Not immediately, because the battle continued its terrible momentum, regardless of who commanded it, but in the deeper, strategic sense. Johnston had been, in the estimation of Jefferson Davis and of many Confederate officers, the finest general the South possessed. His death left Beauregard in command, and Beauregard, fighting a battle he had not entirely believed in from the start, would make a decision as the sun moved west that October afternoon that would be debated for as long as the Confederacy was remembered. Prentiss's position at the Hornet's Nest finally collapsed at approximately 5:30 in the afternoon. Beauregard had massed 62 artillery pieces against it, 62 guns, firing in what was perhaps the largest artillery concentration ever assembled on American soil to that point. And the Federal line simply ceased to exist under that weight of iron and fire. Prentiss himself surrendered with approximately 2,200 men, the remnants of a force that had held for the better part of a day against everything the Confederate Army could throw at it. He was, by any measure, one of the heroes of the battle, though it would take years before his countrymen fully acknowledged it. Do not look away, because in the final light of that bloody Sunday, with 10,000 Federal soldiers already casualties and the Confederate Army pressing toward Pittsburgh Landing, a decision is about to be made that will echo for generations. Beauregard called off the attack at dusk. The Confederate Army was within a mile of Pittsburgh Landing. The Federal Army was broken and bleeding, its survivors pressed against the river, sheltering under the bluff, their backs literally to the water. Union gunboats were firing into the Confederate lines, their massive shells crashing through the timber in the darkness. But Union officers admitted afterward that the situation was desperate. Beauregard believed, not unreasonably, that his men were exhausted, that the battle was as good as won. That morning would bring the final, decisive blow. His orders went out: halt and hold. Resume the attack at dawn. He did not know that at that moment, Buell's lead divisions were crossing the Tennessee River. He did not know that Grant, standing in the rain on the riverbank, had said to Sherman, who had found him there, and had started to say something about withdrawal and reorganization, "No, we'll lick 'em tomorrow." Grant's certainty was either the expression of genuine military judgment or the stubbornness of a man who refused to acknowledge defeat. Perhaps in his case, they were the same thing. The night of April 6th was among the worst that either army would endure. The rain came heavy and cold, turning the battlefield into a swamp, filling the low places with water that ran red. The Federal gunboats kept firing through the darkness, their shells howling overhead and crashing into the Confederate lines in a rhythm that prevented sleep and frayed nerves already stretched to their limit. Men on both sides lay in the mud among the dead and the dying, listening to the cries of the wounded, a sound that every survivor of Shiloh would describe in their memoirs as the thing they could not forget, the sound that followed them for years afterward through the nights of their lives, men calling for water, men calling for their mothers, men simply moaning in a register below language, a sound that belonged to no nation and no cause. Surgeons worked through the night by lantern light, their tables set up in farmhouses and barns, and under the open sky when space ran out. The work they did was brutal and necessary, and performed at a pace that reduced men to objects. This arm, gone. This leg, gone. This wound, survivable. This wound, not. Chloroform was used when available, whiskey when it was not, and sometimes nothing at all. The piles of amputated limbs outside the field hospitals would become, in the accounts of those who saw them, one of the defining images of the battle, a concrete measure of the cost that no casualty figure quite captured. Dawn of April 7th brought the reversal that Grant had promised. Buell's fresh troops, perhaps 25,000 men who had not yet fired a shot in this battle, formed the vanguard of a massive Federal counterattack that struck the Confederate lines before they had time to reorganize and resume their own assault. Grant's battered divisions, resupplied in the night and filled with something that may have been fury, or may simply have been the grim determination of men who had survived the worst day of their lives and were no longer afraid of anything this field could show them, advanced alongside Buell's men in a line that stretched for miles. The Confederates who had gone to sleep the night before, believing themselves on the verge of a magnificent victory, woke to find the situation reversed, the Federal Army coming at them from positions they had not anticipated, and no plan for meeting it. Beauregard fought a rearguard action through the morning and into the afternoon, inflicting considerable casualties on the advancing Federals, and demonstrating, as Confederate infantry would demonstrate many more times in this war, that Southern soldiers who had been beaten could still fight with extraordinary tenacity. But the mathematics had changed irreversibly. The Confederates were outnumbered, their ammunition running low, their commanding general dead, their line of retreat the long muddy road back to Corinth. By early afternoon, Beauregard had ordered the retreat. The Confederate army pulled back, exhausted and diminished but intact, not pursued with the vigor that Grant's officers would later admit might have destroyed it entirely. And then the guns stopped. After 2 days of continuous sound that had literally been heard 40 miles away, after 2 days in which the human capacity for violence had been demonstrated on a scale that dwarfed anything the American continent had previously witnessed, the silence that descended on the Shiloh battlefield was almost physically painful in its completeness. Men who had been deafened by the noise stood in it and found that they did not quite know what to do with it. Some wept. Some sat down in the mud and stared at nothing. Some walked through the battlefield as if in a dream, past the things that lay there, past the evidence of what 2 days had produced, and found that their minds were performing a kind of protective simplification, refusing to fully process what their eyes were seeing. The field itself was almost beyond describing. In the areas of heaviest fighting, the Hornet's Nest, the Peach Orchard, the area around Shiloh Church, the ground had been so churned by artillery fire and the passage of thousands of feet that it barely resembled earth. Trees had been stripped of their bark by musket fire, their trunks pale and wounded-looking in the April light. The peach trees in the orchard had been in full bloom when the battle began, and their blossoms, shaken loose by the concussion of 2 days of artillery, had fallen on the dead and the dying, so that men who had bled out in that orchard lay in a soft pink snow that made the scene simultaneously more beautiful and more terrible than it could otherwise have been. The dead lay everywhere, Union and Confederate together, sometimes so intermingled that it was difficult at first to determine who had been on which side. The mud and the blood, and 2 days in the April heat having reduced them to a common condition that transcended their allegiances. The numbers, when they were finally tallied, were numbers that the country was not prepared for. Nearly 24,000 casualties in 2 days, killed, wounded, missing. More Americans killed and wounded at Shiloh than in all previous American wars combined. The figure was so large that newspapers in both North and South initially questioned it, convinced there must be an error. There was no error. Grant, riding across the field in the aftermath, was seen to be a man struggling to contain what he felt behind the mask of command. One of his officers wrote that Grant looked at the field and said nothing for a long time, and that when he finally spoke, his voice was different from the voice that had given orders for 2 days. A quieter voice, a voice that understood something new. Sherman found him on the evening of April 7th, standing near Shiloh Church, in the darkness that had fallen over the field. Sherman, who had perhaps fought harder than any Union commander in those 2 days, who had lost 2 horses and been wounded, and watched his division nearly destroyed and rebuilt it, and fought it nearly to exhaustion again, rode up to his commanding officer and said, according to accounts, "Well, Grant, we've had the devil's own day, haven't we?" Grant smoked his cigar for a moment in the darkness. "Yes," he said, "lick 'em tomorrow." It was not eloquence. It was not the kind of remark that would be carved into monuments or inscribed in halls of government. It was the remark of a man who had looked at the worst that war could present and chosen, without ceremony or self-congratulation, to continue. And in that choice, in that plain, quiet, almost stubborn refusal to be broken, there was something that the men around him recognized, even in the darkness, even with the field still full of the dead, and the rain still falling, and the night still full of sounds no soldier ever forgets. They recognized it because they had done it themselves. They had been at Shiloh. They had survived it. And they knew, in the way that only those who have passed through a fire know, that nothing on the other side of it would ever look quite the same. The Battle of Shiloh shocked both nations, for the Confederacy was, for a brief and dreadful period, very much its own nation, into a sober reckoning with what they had chosen. The men who had enlisted in those early months on both sides, moved by patriotism or adventure or social pressure or the particular human difficulty of standing still when the current of history is moving, had imagined a war of weeks or a few short months. They had imagined decisive engagements, clear victories, a rapid resolution of a question that could no longer be resolved by argument or legislation. Shiloh answered them with a different kind of clarity. It answered them with 24,000 casualties in 2 days. It answered them with a field that required weeks to bury its dead. It answered them with wounded men who would spend the rest of their lives, some short, some achingly long, with pieces of Shiloh buried in their bodies. The letters written from the camps in the days after the battle have a quality distinct from the letters written before it. The handwriting is sometimes less steady. The sentences are sometimes incomplete, trailing off as if the writer has looked up from the page at something they cannot describe and has decided not to try. Men who had written home with confidence and occasional bravado wrote now with a different register, quieter, more precise, more careful, as if they understood for the first time that words were insufficient to their purpose, and yet continued to use them because words were what they had. I cannot tell you what it was like. I will tell you that I am alive. I will tell you that many men I knew are not. I will tell you that I think of you every hour, and that this is both a comfort and something I cannot describe. Grant would be criticized savagely for Shiloh, for the lack of entrenchments, for the initial surprise, for the horrifying casualty list that seemed to contradict the notion of a well-managed operation. There were calls for his removal. Lincoln, besieged by them, reportedly said something that has become one of the enduring quotations of the war. "I can't spare this man. He fights." Whether Lincoln actually said this in precisely those words, the sentiment it expresses was real. Grant was not removed. He continued west and south, and the road from Shiloh led, by a long and terrible route, to Vicksburg and then to the Overland Campaign, and then to Appomattox, and the lessons he had learned at Pittsburgh Landing. about the cost of unpreparedness, about the necessity of pressing an advantage, about the relationship between survival and the willingness to continue fighting, were lessons he carried with him every mile of that road. Beauregard would be criticized by Jefferson Davis for calling off the attack on the evening of April 6th, a decision that Davis believed had cost the Confederacy a decisive victory. The argument was never fully resolved and probably cannot be. Too many variables, too many unknowns, too many ways in which the night of April 6th might have gone differently than it did. What can be said is that Beauregard made the decision a reasonable commander might have made with the information available to him, and that history, which is always wiser than the men who make it, determined that his decision was wrong. Albert Sidney Johnston was buried in New Orleans with honors that reflected the Confederacy's genuine grief at his loss. Jefferson Davis, who had known Johnston since their days at West Point, said that the Confederacy had lost its best general on the field at Shiloh, and the truth of this is at least arguable. What is not arguable is that Johnston's death removed from Confederate service one of the few officers who combined strategic vision, personal charisma, and the respect of his subordinates in a way that might have made a material difference to the outcome of the Western campaign. War, which is indifferent to the quality of its victims, took him at the moment when his country needed him most. General Prentiss, who had held the Hornet's Nest for 6 hours against the full weight of the Confederate assault, spent the rest of the war as a prisoner, was exchanged in October 1862 and returned to service. His defense of that sunken road was, in the judgment of most serious historians, one of the decisive acts of the battle. The resistance that bought Grant the time he needed. Prentiss lived to be 80 years old and died in 1901, long enough to see the country he had helped hold together make its own way into a new century, long enough to attend reunions where the men who had faced each other across that field shook hands and wept together and tried to find in the passage of years some language adequate to what they had shared. The Shiloh battlefield was established as a national military park in 1894, 32 years after the guns fell silent. The monuments went up, granite and bronze, measured language and carved names, the attempt of the living to do adequate honor to the dead by marking the places where they fell. Visitors came and walked those fields and stood in the Hornet's Nest and looked across the ground that had been so contested at such cost, and tried to feel in the quiet of a Tennessee afternoon something of what it had been. They could not feel it. No one who was not there could feel it. That is the nature of this kind of experience. It belongs entirely to those who lived it, and when they died, it went with them, leaving only the markers and the records and the accounts written in hands that were sometimes steady and sometimes not, by men who knew that they were trying to pass on something that could not, in the end, be passed on. What remains is this: the ground itself, the gentle roll of western Tennessee terrain, the creek beds and the ravines, and the old church rebuilt on its original foundation. The peach trees have been replanted in the orchard where men died in the falling blossoms. In the spring they bloom again, pink and white and indifferent to everything beneath them, the way that living things are indifferent to the past while being made entirely of it. Shiloh, the place of peace. It took 2 days and nearly 24,000 casualties to make the name mean something different. It took the blood of farm boys from Iowa and the sons of plantation owners from Mississippi, the courage of generals and the blind survival of privates, the holding of a sunken road against impossible odds, and the fighting retreat of an exhausted army through the April mud. It took all of this to write into that quiet piece of Tennessee soil a meaning that had nothing to do with the Hebrew word and everything to do with what America, at its most desperate and its most divided, was willing to do to itself. And in that meaning, terrible, indelible, hard-won, the nation found, if not peace, then at least the knowledge of what peace was worth. Because it had seen on those 2 days in April what the alternative looked like. It had seen it in every detail that the living could not bring themselves to describe in full and could not stop themselves from describing anyway. In the letters, in the memoirs, in the testimonies given at reunions decades later, in the faces of old men who had been young on that field and who carried something in their eyes that those who had not been there could recognize without being able to name. They had been at Shiloh, and Shiloh had been inside them ever since. The Battle of Shiloh, April 6th to 7th, 1862, produced 23,746 total casualties, roughly 13,047 Union and 10,699 Confederate, making it the bloodiest engagement in American history to that point. It would not hold that distinction for long.